Really had a good year in 2018. It's another year of growth at the top end, and that growth has been driven by some truly revolutionary whiskeys that you people created. So congratulations to you. We've had some challenges this year as well. Some of it's kind of threatened to dampen the enthusiasm that the Americans have for Canadian whiskey. That comes in the form of higher taxes in Canada. The craft distillers working hand in hand with the big legacy distilleries to educate the public about the damaging effect that taxes have on whiskey, on distilling, and on farmers. I mean, it's farmers who make all the grain that we turn into whiskey. I'd like to extend a special thanks and a huge thanks to Spirits Canada, especially to Jan Westcott, who's been leading the efforts to educate consumers and politicians about this unintended negative consequence. Now, while all of our traditional brands, the traditional legacy distillers, have been raising the bar year after year at the high end of the whiskey spectrum, there have also been some truly significant developments among the new distillers, among the small distillers. Wonderful new whiskeys from distilleries that didn't even exist a decade ago. And these are generating new ideas among consumers about what Canadian whiskey can actually be. Some of these new distillers have participated in the Canadian Whiskey Awards over the years, and they've had considerable success. I see Bob Baxter at the back, who took home Distillery of the Year last year for Yukon Brewers in Whitehorse. But we're pleased, to see now that the craft distillers, the micro distillers, have a new competition that's dedicated exclusively to artisanal distilleries. It's the Canadian Artisanal Spirits Competition, which is now in its second year. It recognizes excellence in all artisanal Canadian spirits. We're not associated with them at all. It's their own thing. They're doing their own thing. But we're very lucky to have the founder of the Canadian Arts and Spirits Awards here tonight, Alex Hamer. At the back, I'd like to encourage you to say hello to Alex. He's doing great stuff for the micro distillers in Canada. Now, put your hand up, Alex, so people can recognize. Yeah, he's the guy in the back there. Now, I do see a lot of familiar faces here. Actually, the room has changed a lot since we first did this in Victoria 8 years ago. There were a lot of new people, a lot of people here who weren't really in the industry when we started doing these awards. And I guess there's no one here more familiar, though, than my dear friend. One of the first people to welcome me into the industry was Tish Harkis. Now, Tish, I understand that this is your 30th anniversary representing Canadian Club. Whoa. Congratulations, Tish. Now, I know that Cape Breton, Canadian Club, when you turn on the tap, Canadian Club comes out, so maybe that's why it's hard to believe you've been doing this for 30 years. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to draw some attention to the growing interest in whiskey tourism in Canada. This is a new and exciting development. I mean, it's happening other places, but it's happening in Canada too. The main thing for tourism is to have distilleries close enough together that people can see a few. So I visited the Okanagan this summer, and I was just delighted to find a brochure for a distillery tour, and it was complete with a little incentive coupon, so you could tear off the coupon and get a discount at one distillery or another. We see that Don Livermore has launched a monthly blending class down at the Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, and I follow you on Instagram, Don, and I see a lot of very happy faces learning how to blend Canadian whiskey. Can you imagine? You're going to learn how to blend Canadian whiskey, and the guy who's teaching you has a PhD in brewing and distilling. Yeah, it's a bit daunting. And then there's Montreal, where Sazerac is going all out to welcome tourists to its old Montreal distillery. This distillery is just a really short, pleasant walk from the heart of old Montreal, which is a tourist haven in Montreal, and it's bound to become a major tourist attraction. So good on Sazerac for doing that. This enthusiasm for visiting distilleries and living whiskey experiences has prompted Blair Phillips, he's my partner at Whisky magazine. Blair and I are writing a new book on the subject. The book's called Canada Distills. It's going to be released early in 2020, it keeps getting pushed back, which features tips and profiles of all the distilleries people might want to visit, including, of course, all of the major players. So now that I've got your attention, I'd just like to turn the microphone over to our guest speaker. We all know John K. Hall, the founder of 40 Creek Distillery. John, I think, has done more to raise the profile of Canadian whiskey than anyone I can think of, at least in the last couple of decades. John took a new approach to marketing Canadian whiskey. He made himself the face of his brands. And over a period of 2 decades, he turned 40 Creek into a true phenomenon, both in Canada and in the U.S. And we were having breakfast this morning, and John said, yeah, and Don Livermore's doing the same thing for Hiram Walker. So, and you're a young man, Don, so we know we got another 20 years with you. In any case, John turned a failing micro distillery into a powerhouse brand. Of course, it's been taken over by Campari, and Campari has good representation here. I just can't think of a better succession path for a small distillery than to have a major company step in and keep it going. And we hope they'll keep your distillery going forever, John. We really do. So in any case, I'd like to introduce John K. Hall. He's here to tell us about his whiskey journey and inspire us on ours.
You'll have to bear with me. I arrived in Victoria at 4:30 my time this morning. So, and Davin and I had breakfast this morning as well. But I'm sure everything will go well. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to be here to share my Canadian whiskey journey and my perspective on Canadian whiskey, even though I have been officially retired for several years now. And I'd like to also say hello to my colleagues at 40 Creek. So it's nice to see you here, continuing to represent 40 Creek. And Davin, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. So my journey. I grew up on the south side of Detroit, which in Canadian terms is called Windsor, Ontario. I grew up just a few city blocks from where Don Livermore creates his magic in the original town of Walkerville, home of the world-famous Hiram Walker Distillery, the original home of Canadian Club, and today home to many other fine Canadian whiskeys such as J.P. Weiser and Good Irma Wirtz. In the late 60s, I had to walk past that Hiram Walker Distillery twice a day, hiking to and from school. There must have been something in the aromas that were emanating from that distillery, because when I graduated in 1970, the only job I wanted was to be a whiskey maker for Hiram Walker. Now, this was the boom years of the 70s, when every graduate had at least 2 or 3 job offers before they were even out of their graduation gown. The only exception to that rule was me. I was the only grad from my chemistry microbiology department that graduated without a job. So unfortunately, or fortunately, Hiram Walker never hired me. So even though I grew up in the 60s, I never thought life was about finding yourself. I had always thought that life was about creating yourself. So I needed an alternate plan. So I jumped into my 1953 Flathead Ford and headed up to the Niagara Peninsula and became a winemaker for Parkdale Wines. And ended up making some wonderful wines, such as Derby Sherry and Derby Port. A bottle of Canadian Sherry back in 1970 sold for $1.05. We had a saying back there, come alive for $1.05 and do it again for $2.10. Other favorite wines in my portfolio were Country Roads apple wine, Alpenweiss, Capistro. You may remember some of these wines, I don't know. Canada Cooler, Rockaberry Cooler, Casabello Gala Cake, 4-liter bag in a box. These were some of my one-hit wonders of the 70s and 80s. In the late 80s, I led a management buyout, a leverage buyout of that wine company from its owner, John Labatt Limited. It had become the second largest wine company in Canada, with wineries in Penticton, BC, Calgary, Alberta, Niagara Falls, Ontario, and Scoudouc, New Brunswick. In 1992, after spending 22 years in the wine business, I was thinking once again that life was about creating yourself, and I really needed to find a new canvas to satisfy my creative thirst. I had noticed in the late 1980s that the Scotch whiskey industry was stepping up their game and introducing some very fine single malt Scotch whiskeys. And the good old boys down in Kentucky were introducing some fine small batch bourbons. But in Canada, nothing was happening. It seemed like Canadian whiskey was stuck in the mud or a snowbank. Everything was the same old, same old. I decided I would attempt to realize my original dream job, even though it would not be with Hiram Walker. I would open up my own distillery and create my own handcrafted Canadian whiskey. All of the facts said that this was a very bad idea. 10 years earlier, in 1982, Canadian whiskey had hit its peak at 8 million cases. By 1992, it had declined by 50%. It had lost 4 million cases in 10 years. It was plain and simple. It was a disaster that wasn't letting up. Even the federal government jumped in to fan the flames by introducing an annual escalating excise tax. And in addition, during that same 10-year period, 15 distilleries closed in Canada. The industry was rationalizing. By the time it was all over, there were only 7 distilleries in Canada making whiskey. That was a far cry from the 200 distilleries that existed around the early 1900s. They say timing is everything, but it sure didn't look that way in 1992. Even the English writer David Broom wrote in his book, The Handbook of Whiskey, he said, "But hang on a minute. This is Canada, a country that has witnessed a radical shrinking of its whiskey industry. If the big guys can't do it, what crazy man like John Hall decides to start making whiskey just as everyone else is closing down distilleries. I had to kind of scratch my head on that one. Even industry colleagues said, John, you'll never survive. The whiskey business is a big boys game. But I could strategically see three significant trends happening. People were drinking less, but they were drinking better quality whiskeys. The distilleries in Canada had declined from 22 to 7. And they were not introducing any new whiskeys to consumers. I knew that rationalization of any industry always provided opportunities for startup companies to service niche segments in the marketplace. So against all odds, I opened the distillery and started making and barreling my whiskeys. Oh, and since I didn't have deep pockets, I needed to create some cash flow. I knew I could get wines out on the market very quickly within 12 months versus aged spirits, which takes much longer. So I started up my winery called Kittling Ridge Estates, and I also developed a few non-age spirits along the way. Again, as one-hit wonders. And Bill Ashburn, the whiskey master at Forty Creek, will remember some of these. Wonderful favorites. Freeze and squeeze slushy cocktail. Loaded soda vodka cooler. Chaos hard lemonade. Shaker's cocktails. Inferno pepper pot vodka. And Quantum Beyond vodka and others. Oh, and I started a second distillery in Yingchuan, northwest China. Bill has been there. And made vodka from Chinese-grown corn and sold that vodka in Russia. But that's a whole other story for another time. It was nearing the year 2000, and it was time to get my whiskey out. It was about time. I thought my barreled whiskeys were tasting pretty good by now, and my friends liked them too. I heard about this whiskey competition in Europe, so I blended up a few bottles and sent them over, and lo and behold, I won a gold medal. One of the judges on that panel was a fellow who wrote the first ever World Definitive Guide to Whiskeys. His name was Michael Jackson. And upon tasting my whiskey, Michael declared, "This is the finest Canadian whiskey I've ever tasted. Wins points for luxury." Michael went on to say, "The most revolutionary whiskey in Canada may very well be John Hall's whiskey. John has brought a handcrafted sensibility to whiskey, and in doing so has broken the barriers of whiskey. His whiskey is delightful and has an international timeless appeal." I was thrilled, to say the least. Michael liked my whiskey so much, he called me up from London, England, and asked if he could visit my distillery, and indeed he did. And it was wonderful and very enjoyable to guide him through the distillery to taste the various whiskey barrels. Although Michael unfortunately passed away in 2005, I'm proud that we are both members of Whiskey Magazine's Whiskey Hall of Fame. Michael is inductee number 1, and I'm inductee number 42. I now knew my whiskey was ready to go to market, but it needed a name. I wanted to call it Johnny Hall Whiskey. Just like Johnny Walker, Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, Joe Seagram, John Jameson, James Chivas, John Dewar, and J.P. Weiser. These men were whiskey makers, and I had become a whiskey maker. All their names started with J. So did mine. They were so proud of their whiskey, they put their name right on the bottle. I could relate to that. It takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But my name, well, it just didn't seem to have quite the same ring. So being a little superstitious, I decided to name my whiskey after the creek where my distillery stood, 40 miles from Niagara Falls, on a creek called 40 Mile Creek. The settlement originally was called On the 40, so I named the whiskey 40 Creek in honor of the early settlers. I launched in Canada, and 14 years later, 40 Creek Whiskey had become the third largest selling premium deluxe whiskey in Canada. It wasn't easy, but I knew if I could just get my whiskey into consumers' mouths, they would embrace it. It was a 24/7 for many years. I basically lived in liquor stores and bars for half my life, and the other half in the distillery. We expanded the distillery 3 times, from 50,000 square feet to 175,000 square feet. I was the largest purchaser of in-store tastings and personally executed most of them, and spent every Friday and Saturday behind tasting tables in at least 4 to 6 stores each day, asking people to try the whiskey. Thousands of in-store tastings. Thousands of product seminars for liquor store employees, bartenders, and waitstaff, and extensive travel throughout Canada and the U.S. In my final year, the distillery was achieving over 500,000 cases of spirits each year and still growing in double digits. Nationally, it was the 5th largest supplier of spirits to Canadian liquor boards. Just before my divestiture, the 5-year national growth of spirits in Canada, that would be from 2009 to 2014, was plus 3%. My growth for the same 5 years was plus 65%. I actually created 34% of the entire national growth in those 5 years. All around the world, Canada is known for its hockey, maple syrup, and Canadian whiskey. In fact, Canadian whiskey and railroads built this country. I'm very proud to have been a part of the revival of our country's iconic spirit. The spirit market in Canada is an 18 million case market, growing at 4%. Whiskey owns 28% of that, at 5.2 million cases. The majority of that is owned by Canadian whiskey, at a 70% share. That's 3.5 million cases. That means 1 out of every 5 bottles of spirits consumed in Canada is Canadian whiskey. It also means 2 out of every 3 bottles of whiskey sold in Canada are Canadian whiskeys. The best news is 70% of those Canadian whiskey sales are premium and deluxe priced whiskeys. In the United States, at one time our whiskey was by far the largest spirit. But even today, in the U.S., Canadian whiskey is growing at 7%. It's the 4th largest selling spirit at 17.5 million cases, just behind vodka, rum, and bourbon. And as reported in the New York Times recently, high-end premium Canadian whiskey has recently experienced a 112% leap in the U.S. market. And when you combine the U.S. market and the Canadian markets, Canadian whiskey is the largest selling whiskey in North America. In fact, our whiskey outsells all the bourbon, plus all of the Scotch, plus all of the Irish whiskeys, plus all the other whiskeys combined in North America. Obviously, there's a few factors that are affecting this shifting tide. Way back, flavored vodkas were introduced 15 years ago to new legal drinking age consumers. Those early adopters have evolved. They've moved on. They want a more mature taste experience. More than any other category, Canadian whiskey delivers the perfect mix. It's approachable, it's friendly by nature, it provides complexity and richness in its taste. As I mentioned earlier, when I started in the whiskey industry, there were only 7 whiskey distillers left in Canada. I'm sure many of you can remember the shelf set for Canadian whiskey. It hadn't changed in over 70 years. When I launched 40 Creek Whiskey, it was the first successfully launched Canadian whiskey since 1939. Today, I'm thrilled to note that we are quickly approaching the 200 mark for distilleries in Canada. And as recently as the past 24 months, there has been an explosion of new Canadian whiskey brands and taste expressions introduced to the market. And to my delight, there are 2 more prominent Canadian winemakers entering the whiskey category. One from the West and one from the East. Anthony Von Mandel recently announced that he was entering the whiskey market and was going to totally redefine Canadian whiskey. You got a big job ahead of you. I really look forward to tasting his results. And John Peller and Wayne Gretzky have teamed up to score big in the Canadian whiskey arena with Gretzky's 99 whiskey. It's too bad Wayne didn't save all those hockey sticks from all the goals he scored in his lifetime with the NHL. I'm sure those wooden sticks could have recycled into some pretty remarkable whiskey barrels. All these factors are bringing so much more attention to Canadian whiskey. I believe this is only the tip of the iceberg, and we will continue to see new entries entering the market. Certainly the more the merrier. We also need to thank bartenders and mixologists for their creativity and support of Canadian whiskeys. At the beginning of the cocktail culture, it was all white spirits. But the past few years, cocktails are trending to brown spirits, perfectly positioned for Canadian whiskey due to its mixability and the flavors that Canadian whiskey can bring to the party. Culinary arts have also embraced Canadian whiskey on several fronts. Canadian whiskey as an ingredient in food preparation and food pairings. Chefs continue to discover the versatility of Canadian whiskey. Whiskey maker dinners used to be one of my favorite events to attend. Very fun events. Whiskey festivals. I remember when I first displayed at whiskey festivals. Most of the time it would be the only Canadian whiskey at the show. Whiskey festivals have exploded in Canada, from only a few festivals 5 years ago to more than 20 today, and growing. Now at least a dozen or more Canadian whiskey brands are at these shows, and it's great to see their ever-increasing presence. It's great to see whiskey writers and bloggers discovering and writing more and more about our whiskeys. This gives their followers confidence to explore Canadian whiskey. Both Whiskey Magazine and Whiskey Advocate have retained dedicated writers to cover Canadian whiskey. Writers, bloggers are putting Canadian whiskey back on the world stage. And of course, we have Davin's second edition revised and updated Canadian Whiskey, the Portable Expert. While much has been written about other world whiskeys, Canada's national spirit has always been left in the shadows until Davin brilliantly captured Canada's true spirit. He takes the reader on an engaging and informative journey of discovery, revealing the art, the science, the history, and the passion of the whiskey men behind Canada's iconic elixir. Thank you, Davin, for that. Social media. I mean, that deserves an entire breakout session just on its own. But we're dealing with a customer that more than ever makes informed choices and has instant access to resources and communication. Social media has allowed us to become closer to our customers, establishing stronger relationships and providing the tools for our biggest fans to be our biggest asset. I used to enter hundreds of whiskey competitions in the US, England, and Europe to bring notoriety and attention to my brand. Thank goodness today, in its 9th year, we have a whiskey tasting competition in Canada dedicated to Canadian whiskey. The Canadian Whiskey Awards held right here in Victoria, BC, tonight. It's providing the bragging rights for all Canadian whiskey makers to share with customers and build a Canadian whiskey category, both at home and abroad. It gives our brands credibility with experts around the world, instilling confidence for customers to discover or rediscover this category. Indeed, I've had the fortunate pleasure to win a few of these awards over the years. Again, Davin, thank you for creating the Canadian Whiskey Awards. All of these factors are amplified by the fact that the Canadian whiskey drinker is an extremely brand loyal customer, more loyal than any other beverage category. If they accept your whiskey brand, you can usually have them for life, and they will share and introduce their discovery to their family and friends. Here's an example of brand loyalty. You remember that whiskey I briefly mentioned was introduced in 1939? Yes, that was Crown Royal. 80 years later, it is still the #1 selling whiskey in Canada. Now that's what I call brand loyalty. Canadian whiskey is truly on the rise. I very much encourage you to invest and reinvest in Canadian whiskey and continue to bring new customers to the category. You know, as they say, the bigger the neighborhood, the more the candy. And all Canadian whiskey makers will benefit. I would be remiss if I did not comment on the role for the federal and provincial governments in determining the destination of Canadian whiskey. They're already taking 80% of the retail price in the form of taxes and markups. They must recognize the injuries that they have caused this industry. They did it back in the 1980s with the escalating excise tax, and now they're repeating history with unfair taxes and distribution again. There's a great opportunity for both governments to embrace the excitement, the creativity, and the enthusiasm that all these nearly 200 Canadian spirit makers possess. But in order to succeed, they will require solid commitment from the governments and their agencies. I have always realized that if you live life, life will teach you how to live. Since I was that student hiking across the Hiram Walker property, I knew that I wanted to be a Canadian whiskey maker. But me, dancing with the giants in the whiskey world, I mean, even that surpassed my wildest dreams. So I'll leave you with this. If you attempt the impossible, perhaps the impossible will become your reality. Everything starts with a dream. It doesn't matter what company you are working for, a big one, a small one, or a new one, or an old one, your own or somebody else's. At some point, it was just someone's dream that was converted into reality. And now let's get on with celebrating Canadian whiskey with the 9th Annual Canadian Whiskey Awards. Thank you very much.
John K. Hall's Lifetime Achievement Award. He's the number one in the Hall of Fame for Canadian whiskey. John, when we get to number 39, we're going to call you back. And you can be number 40. So for the 9th year, the Canadian Whisky Awards will recognize the best whiskies that Canada produces. And believe me, there are a lot of really awesome whiskies produced in Canada in 2018, 2019. As I mentioned earlier, a lot has changed in 9 years. The most encouraging trend has been the steady growth of flavorful whiskeys being recognized not just in Canada, but right around the world. We're about to find out who this year's shining stars are. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the Canadian Whisky Awards. The awards continue to operate on a non-profit basis. They're supported by people who have a genuine love of Canadian whiskey. The judging is done entirely blind. None of the 10 judges knows what they are tasting. And they aren't going to know until we reveal the winners tonight. So you can be sure they're giving an unbiased opinion. And with 10 judges, each judge has only a little bit of influence. Every year we change the judging panel a little bit to make sure we're getting new opinions. We don't want to get into a rut. On our panel this year, we have Mark Tardif from Quebec Whisky. This year we had Sarah Phelps. She joined the judging panel this year. Mark Bylock and longtime judge Chris Shoemaker, all from Ontario. Jason Debley is a popular whiskey blogger from New Brunswick. He's especially popular in the States and in Texas for some reason. We have Chip Dykstra, who's also known as the Rum Howler from Edmonton, very influential. He has a huge following, people who read his Canadian whiskey reviews. Blair Phillips and Jason Hambry of Whiskey Magazine have joined us. Jason's just joined us recently. He's doing the French edition of Whiskey Magazine, and he's also writing for American Whiskey Magazine. And our final judge, based in England, is Gordon Homer. So each judge scores the whiskey from samples that we distribute, and they submit numerical scores. These are rolled together in a spreadsheet, and then finding the winners is really a matter of simple arithmetic. We take the average of the scores, and it just goes from top to bottom. So the whiskeys with the highest scores are the winners. Now, before we get to the results, I want to thank my wife, Janet, who for the second year has handled all of the logistics of receiving the whiskeys, assigning them their secret codes, and to keep the process blind, of course, and pouring well over 1,000 60 ml samples, then assembling the judges' packages, because we send them out to the judges. They judge in their own, the comfort of their own homes, over a period of about 6 weeks. So Janet, thank you very much. Thank you. Again, the awards will be presented by our hostess and publicist, Heather Leary. She's been working tirelessly behind the scenes getting us ready for this evening. So welcome, Heather. Come on up. We have a record number of entries this year, so many that we will change the flow a little bit tonight, just so we can keep things moving. So whiskeys that have won medals will be recognized in groups by the producer, so that we don't have the same person coming up with half a dozen times, rather than doing it individually. So we're going to start with the bronze medals. And the first bronze medal goes to a whiskey called 100 Bushels. I don't think we have anyone here from 100 Bushels tonight. Constellation Brands. Bronze medals for Black Velvet, Black Velvet Reserve. That's you?
That's us.
Come on up there. Black Velvet Toasted Caramel. This is one of two of my wife's favorite whiskeys, and Shenley Golden Wedding. Congratulations, we have 4 bronze medals. Very well done. We're really pleased to have Black Velvet in the competition. A woman who used to make it, Vicki Miller, is a very good, someone who I truly admire. Canadian Club from Beam Suntory. We have bronze medals for Canadian Club Barley Batch, Canadian Club Premium 1858, and also from Beam Alberta Premium. We could have someone from Beam. Tish Marcus.
Watch out. Would have been kind of fun. Oh, great. This is not good.
And after it's all over, I'm washing the dishes. From Central City Brewing, we have 2 bronze medals, one for the peeled orange liqueur, whiskey liqueur, and another for Lowen McKinnon, tequila barrel finished. Do we have anyone here from Central City? I don't see anyone I recognize tonight. There's this truly wacko guy by the name of Sébastien Roy in New Brunswick. He has a distillery called Fils du Roi, and they have 3 bronze medals for Fils du Roi Appellations Canadian Rye, Fils du Roi Single Malt Whiskey, Fils du Roi Single Malt for Richelieu International. So 3 bronze medals for Fils du Roi. 40 Creek bronze medals for Copper Pot and 40 Creek Spike. Bill Ashburn. Thank you. I think he's in a 40 Creek commercial driving a forklift or something. Gibson's Finest Sterling. Josh, here. Come on now. Great job. Nice, Jack. From Divine Wine and Spirits, we have Glen Saanich. Glen Saanich, made right here in Victoria. Well, just up the peninsula in Saanich. Golden Stag is another new whiskey. I don't think there's anyone here representing Golden Stag. They have a bronze medal. We're going going to, now, you better get your arm ready here, Heather. We're going to need about 10 of those things for Corby Distillery. Bronze medals. It's interesting. Some of these bronze medals are going to whiskeys that won gold medals in the beginning. It's not that the whiskeys are not as good. They're just as good. It's just that there's so many terrifically wonderful new whiskeys that are coming out here. I used to say to people when they absolutely had to have the latest great whiskey, don't worry, there'll be a better one next year. And there always is, and that's the case here. J.P. Weiser's 18-year-old. J.P. Weiser's 15-year-old. J.P. Weiser's Apple, J.P. Weiser's Deluxe, and this is a wonderful drink that I've drank all summer, J.P. Weiser's Old Fashioned Whiskey Cocktail, J.P. Weiser's Triple Barrel Rye, 45%, J.P. Weiser's Vanilla, the Lanny McDonald bottle from the NHL Alumni Series. Isn't that a fabulous idea? Royal Reserve, and Walker's Special Old Rye. Another whiskey that really needs to be revived. Is there somebody from Corby here also? I don't see Colin here tonight. Last Mountain Single Cask Rye and Last Mountain Single Malt both have bronze medals, as do from Quebec, Lecaille, Civo, what did they say that? And the Single Malt Civo, bronze medals for those. We have Masterson's 10-year-old straight rye whiskey. Remember a couple of years ago, Masterson's was Whiskey of the Year. A distillery in Ottawa, north of 7. They're 4-grain whiskey, and they're 95% rye whiskey, both bronze medals. Pemberton Valley Single Malt 8-year-old, Single Barrel Organic, again a bronze medal. I know we have people here tonight from Shelter Point, so we're going to give you 3 bronze medals, Shelter Point, for the Avant-Garde Barley, the Shelter Point Cask Strength, and Shelter Point Single Malt. Is there somebody from Shelter Point? If you're talking to Jake later, you might want to ask him what his father-in-law was carrying at his wedding. Stock and Barrel 100% rye cask strength, Stock and Barrel Blue Blend, and Stock and Barrel single malt cask strength have bronze medals. These have bronze medals. I know that Yukon Brewers sent a few people to the awards this year. So Bob, we're going to send you home with 2 bronze medals, one for Release 11 and one for Release 8. 2 brewers, Release 11, 2 brewers, Release 8. These are single malt whiskeys made in Canada, but they have a brewery, so they didn't bother checking the casks until they were 7 or 8 years old, and these whiskeys compete head-to-head with any Scotch whiskey you can taste. Same age. Take care, Bob. Thanks. Well, congratulations to all the people who've won bronze medals. We're going to move on now to the silver medals. This is a whiskey that I just loved when I tasted it, Black Velvet Onyx. Congratulations. Canadian Club, Chairman's Select, 100% rye. I don't see anyone here from Canadian Rockies. Canadian Rockies 17-year-old taking home a silver medal. Oh, Victoria! Congratulations. Speech last year. Stephen's a runner, and that's the only way he knew that he had broken his femur because it was his speed slowed down. So Stephen's not able to be here tonight to represent Crown Royal. I think if Jean is here, we have 5 silver medals for Crown Royal. Crown Royal Limited Edition, Crown Royal Northern Harvest Rye, Crown Royal Reserve, Crown Royal Wine Barrel Finished, and Crown Royal XO. If you're here, Jean, that'd be great to We have silver medals tonight for 40 Creek, 4 silver medals for 40 Creek. 40 Creek Barrel Select, 40 Creek Confederation Oak, 40 Creek Double Barrel, and 40 Creek Unity. And Gibson's 3 silver medals for Gibson's. Gibson's Finest Bold 8-year-old. This is the bargain of the century, that whiskey. Gibson's Finest Rare 12-year-old. I get more emails about this whiskey from Americans than any other whiskey. They want to know where they can buy it. And Gibson's Venerable 18-year-old. So Josh, 3 silver medals. Again, Hardemacher Distillery. Silver medals for J.P. Weiser's Alumni Whiskey Series, Guy Lafleur. J.P. Weiser's Seasoned Oak. J.P. Weiser's Triple Barrel Aged 10 years. J.P. Weiser's Triple Barrel Rye 43.4%. And Weiser's Special Blend. Is someone from Weiser's taking special? Again, from Central City Brewing, Lowen McKinnon Chocolate Malt, scrumptious. Lowen McKinnon Lightly Peated Single Malt. Yeah, we should get a chocolate medal for those guys. And for Pendleton Midnight and Pendleton Whiskey both take silver medals. Shelter Point, classic single malt, the Strath edition. Now I don't know, Adam, if you're going to take that or if we're going to let Jacob come and get that. And Shelter Point double barreled. Stock and Barrel Canadian Red Blend silver medal. Silver medal for Two Brewers Release 10. Wayne Gretzky has left. It's too bad because we have 2 silver medals for Wayne Gretzky number 99 ice cask whiskey and Wayne Gretzky number 99 red cask whiskey. That wraps it up for the silver medals. So now we have gold medals for Bareface, Canadian Club Classic Small Batch 12-year-old. And Canadian Club 41-year-old. Victoria, we'll get you back up here for a gold medal for Canadian Rockies 21-year-old. Sazerac, Caribou Crossing Single Barrel, Rich and Rare Reserve. Come on up, Drew. Drew came up from Kentucky for this. Woo. Thanks. Again, Gene, we have gold medals for Crown Royal 13-year-old Blender's Mash, Crown Royal Black, Crown Royal Blender's Mash, it's called Bourbon Mash in Canada, and Crown Royal XR. Forty Creek. We have a gold medal for 40 Creek Cream and a second gold medal for 40 Creek 22-year-old Rye. From Harlan Walker Distillery, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 gold medals. Holy crow. Gooderham & Worts 11 Souls. Spectacular whiskey. Gooderham & Worts 4 grade. The J.P. Weiser's Alumni Whiskey Series, Wendell Clark. J.P. Weiser's 35-year-old. J.P. Weiser's Canada 2018. Lot number 40, 11-year-old cask strength. Lot number 40. Pike Creek 21-year-old European finish. And Pike Creek double-barreled Canadian whiskey. Last Mountain Single Cask Wheat Whiskey, really great whiskey from a micro distiller. Pendleton 1910, 12-year-old, both with gold medals, as does Shelter Point Montfort DL. Go on up, please. 9. And that brings us to the end of the gold medals. So what I'd like to now move on. This is the part we've all been waiting for. This is the part that counts, the awards. And we have already recognized John Cahill. Flavored Whiskey of the Year Export Market, Black Velvet, Toasted Caramel. Flavored Whiskey of the Year, Multi-Market, Crown Royal, Salted Caramel. The Whiskey Value, Domestic Market, Wayne Gretzky, number 99, Red Cask. Whiskey Value Export Market, and I know the gray market in Alberta kind of makes this a little more difficult, but it's Pendleton Whiskey. And the Whiskey Value Multi-Market Crown Royal Blender's Mash. Sippin' Whiskey of the Year, Domestic Market, Canadian Rockies, 21-year-old. You don't have to run. It's great whiskey. Great whiskey's worth waiting for. It takes time, don't it? Sippin' Whiskey Export Market, Rich and Rare Reserve. Sippin' Whiskey of the Year Export Market, Rich and Rare Reserve. Sadly. Sippin' Whiskey of the Year Multi-Market, White Creek Rum Barrel. Award of Excellence for Innovation. Jake, we're going to bring you up for Shelter Point, Montfort, DL. This whiskey, they can trace it back to the individual field where the barley was grown. So we're talking about terroir in whiskey because every year the weather changes the flavor of the grain, so every year the weather changes the flavor of the whiskey. Somebody somewhere had a really brilliant idea for line extension this year. And so the Award of Excellence for line extension goes to Corey for the NHL Alumni Series. What a great idea. Man, they got a whole bunch of new people really keen about whiskey. The Best Whiskey Spirit goes to a whiskey that's not actually a whiskey yet, because it's too young. It's going to Ancient Grains Divine. Colin's not here tonight because the artisanal distiller of the year is Last Mountain Distillery. And the distillery of the year for 2019 is the Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, Ontario. It says J.P. Weiser's Distillery. Sorry. Should be Hiram Walker and Sons. Well, I mean, come on. It's not like they've been there since 1858. Okay. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. We're getting down to the finalists for Canadian Whisky of the Year. So each of the following 8 whiskeys is a candidate for Canadian Whisky of the Year. Forty Creek Cream is the flavored whiskey of the year, flavored whiskey domestic, 40 Creek Cream. Whisky of the year, the domestic market, is Canadian Club, 41-year-old.
Yes.
The Connoisseur Whisky of the Year, the export market is Crown Royal Blender's Mash, 13-year-old. And the Connoisseur Whisky of the Year, multi-market, J.P. Weiser's 35-year-old. Best new whiskey, Bareface. Where did this whiskey come from? It's wonderful. The best single malt whiskey is Two Brewers. It says release 10 here, but it's release 9. Two Brewers. Best single malt whiskey of the year. The best fall rye whiskey is 40 Creek 22-year-old rye. Bill's using this. He shows championship dogs, and he spent a lot of time collecting awards on the dog show circuit as well. The best blended whiskey is Gooder and Wort's 11 Souls. We should have a blender of the year too, because Don, you've done a brilliant job on Gooder and Wort's, Little Trinity, and now 11 Souls. And wonderful whiskey. The best blended whiskey is Gooder and Wort's. we thought we were lucky when we got past 8 participants. But here we come down to the part where I do have to disappoint a lot of people and make one team very happy. Because the Canadian Whiskey of the Year for 2019 is 40 Creek 22-year-old Rye. We'd like the winners to stick around, please, and we'll get some photos afterwards down with that photo screen at the back. We do need photos for the media, for press and so on. If we get the winners to stick around, it would be great. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Next year is going to be very special. Next year will be our 10th anniversary, and we hope you'll all be back, because we're going to celebrate many other achievements, including, we have the data, we're going to present next year Canadian Whiskey of the Decade. So we hope that will encourage all of you to go back to your distilleries and start making whiskey even better and even better, so you can submit it for the awards next year. I will ask the winners to stick around. So thank you very much. And, good night. Stick around and